Hey Gardener, Taylor here from the Community Garden Podcast. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to provide you with some housekeeping items before we get started. If you're new to the podcast, every week, every 2 weeks, the beginning of the podcast gets updated. So the information that I'm delivering to you right now is relevant and will be removed when it's no longer relevant. So if you've already heard this, if you're binge watching or binge listening, fast forward to about 5 or 6 minutes and we'll launch into the actual episode. So for today, it is currently the week of October 20th. And for folks in the Northern Hemisphere or for folks who are in similar zones, I'm in zone 6B and my first frost date is supposed to be early October. It's now October 20th and we still haven't actually had a frost, but the plants are starting to be damaged from the cold. We're getting about -3 degrees Celsius overnight right now, at least tonight. So we're pretty much done in the garden now. If you haven't had a chance, go into your garden and just remove. Actually, you could technically leave your entire garden, but if you're planning to remove anything from your garden, go ahead and snip the plants at the base. Don't actually pull them up out of the soil as long as they weren't diseased. You can go ahead and let them break down into the soil, and it also helps with better water access for next year, getting water down into the soil, and will help a little bit with soil erosion. If your plants were diseased, pull them out fully. You can also leave all your plants over winter. You do not need to take them out of your garden. Don't let anyone make you think so. So now that we're done with the season, there's likely nothing else coming out of your garden. I still have a few loofahs, some flowers still going, a couple of small things, but for the most part, the season is over, folks. So my suggestion to you over the next couple of weeks, this will probably be the last time I update this until realistically November, December. I would really love for you to make note about your gardening season. Please, please, please journal. Write down the things that you learned this year. Write down the things that you want to do differently next year. Write your observations down. Write your questions down. Write all your ideas down. Spring you will thank winter you, okay? Please. Also, as you're out in your garden mourning its loss, if you see any seeds that have matured, you can go ahead and pop them off your plants. Marigolds are a really fun way to save seeds. You'll wait for the seed heads to, become dry and crunchy, and they usually turn black. You can go ahead and pop them off. You can store them in a paper bag. There's lots of fun plants to pull seeds off of. Snapdragons, the little heads turn brown, and then they have little holes in the top, and you can flip it over and shake the seeds into your hand. Another fun one is coriander or cilantro. It's very obvious when the seeds are ready, so take a peek at the plants that are still in your garden, see if you can pull any seeds off them. Also, this is for anyone listening to this podcast. If you've ever thought about organizing a community garden, requesting a community garden in whatever area you live in, now is the time to start thinking about that if you have any sort of winter break. So right now, we're not going to be gardening now until March, April. So we do all of our prep work during the winter months. So this is when we take new garden requests. This is when we assess new sites. We discuss partnerships with different organizations. So if this is something that you have been personally wanting to do or your organization has been wanting to do, now is the time to start prepping. Okay, let's talk about some local activities. So these are folks who are in Southern Ontario, you live in Brantford, Brant County, Hamilton, Haldimand, Norfolk, and you want to get involved with our organization. We have a couple of things coming up that I want to put on your radar. So we are participating in the Brantford Santa Claus Parade. November 30th, we are having another parade float. Last year, we had a really fun 50-foot parade float. One of our volunteers, Ken, built a massive greenhouse on the float. I made a bunch of vegetable costumes. They were like sandwich board costumes. It was so much fun. The float definitely was DIY, but it was so cute, and we really had a blast doing it together. So we're going to be doing it again this year. If you want to participate, our parade committee is going to be meeting on October 20th in the evening virtually, and you can get that link from me by emailing grow@egcgbrant.ca, or you can take a peek at our show notes page for the podcast and click the Contact Us button, and that would be the communitygardenpodcast.ca. So Santa Claus Parade, come join us. You get to dictate how much time you can give. You do not need to have any experience. Next thing, so this is very exciting. A couple of years ago, we hosted an Earth Day Community Garden Building Festival. Nope, Earth Day Community Building Festival, and we're going to be kind of re-envisioning that festival as a garden festival this year located at the Greenhouse and Learning Center. It'll be the grand opening. So that'll be happening in June of 2025. It's now all hands on deck to get this festival planned. So if you want to volunteer with us on the committee on the day of, whatever the case is, email grow@egcgbrant.ca or go to the show notes page. We're also looking for organizations who want to participate in an educational way or, have some sort of offering day of. So if you work in the horticulture, green space, environmental, gardening world, and you have something educational to offer or something of value to offer during the festival and you want to promote the organization or you want to participate, reach out, please. If you have ever thought about joining the board of directors for Eagle Ground Community Gardens, we will be having our annual general meeting in January. This is just something for you to start thinking about now. We're always recruiting for director positions as well as for committee lead positions. So I will update this when we have the final date, but our AGM's in January, and just start thinking maybe you want to get involved on the back end. We also are hosting a tree planting event at the new greenhouse site on November 2nd at 10 a.m. So you can come. Please ensure you are wearing closed-toed shoes, although it's a little too cold to be wearing sandals anyways, and consider bringing a shovel and some drinking water. We're going to be planting a permaculture orchard. This will give you a good opportunity to see the greenhouse, to see the park before maybe other folks have been able to. Also, Belonging Brant, we mentioned this in episode 8 with Armanda Lambert. Belonging Brant is hosting the ABCD Symposium for 2025 in May, and we are currently planning for the symposium. We're looking for community members to come join our committee. So if this is something that interests you, you want to learn more about ABCD, asset-based community development, shoot me a message. And finally, for my organizations that are listening, I have a couple of recommendations for you. If you haven't gotten to it yet, episode 9 with Roger Doran is about Seed Money. It's a fundraising platform for community gardens. It is a global platform. Please check out that episode and register for a Seed Money campaign. Your registration has to be in by November 12th, and then the campaign for anyone listening runs from November 15th to December 15th. And look into all the campaigns that are running and please consider donating. There is an Ontario Agriculture Infrastructure Grant due October 31st. If you've ever thought about building a greenhouse with your community garden organization, this may be a grant opportunity for you. And if you just Google Ontario Agriculture Infrastructure, it should come up. It's due by October 31st. There's also a grant right now through the Ontario Trillium Foundation. It's their Grow Grant. It's due by November 4th. And this allows various organizations to sustain their operations. It has nothing to do with gardening, but if you have been looking for an operations or a programming grant, this may be the grant for you. So I just wanted to share some of these pieces with you. I apologize, this is a little bit longer than normal. It's because I love to talk. Yeah, we're at 8 minutes. So I'm going to let you go. We're going to get into the episode now. I hope you enjoy it. As always, you can always reach out to us at podcast@egcgbrant. You can reach out to us through the show notes page at the communitygardenpodcast.ca. Email me, message me, send us a message on social media. I'm always happy to answer questions and help you out. Okay, let's get started.
Hey gardener, you're listening to the Community Garden Podcast. I'm your host, Taylor. In this space, we'll dig into the dirt with local gardeners of all skill levels to share tips, tricks, and stories from our gardening adventures. Let's get growing.
Hey gardeners, Taylor here, back for another episode of the Community Garden Podcast. This is so exciting because this is episode 4, which means this podcast has now been out in the world for about a month, and we've had some really great feedback, and it's been really wonderful to be working on this project. So today we're chatting with Michelle Jameson, who is also the owner of the Golden Age Management Company, which we're going to talk about during the episode, so I won't give you any spoilers. Michelle grew up in a gardening household, but really dived in about 3 years ago when her and her fiance moved to a new property here in Brantford, and they quickly got to work revamping the backyard and creating garden beds. Now, Michelle identifies as a beginner gardener, which, as many of you probably know, starts off with a ton of trial and error. So Michelle kind of walks us through about, some of the hurdles that she experienced while gardening and some of the lessons that she's learned. And I will say this episode is full of knowledge for beginner gardeners. So if you're a beginner gardener, buckle up. Michelle almost exclusively grows food gardens, isn't really interested in the ornamentals. And as I mentioned, it identifies as a beginner gardener. So during this episode, we talk about soil quality, seed saving, irrigation in a home garden, which we've never had a chance to chat with somebody about. So exciting. As well as tips for growing seedlings for beginners, among many, many other topics. So again, this episode is stuffed full of information. We talk a lot about different resources. We mention a lot of different products that we use in the garden. And all of this can be found in a very chunky show notes page directly on our website, thecommunitygardenpodcast.ca. Whatever app you're using to listen to this, you get a preview of the show notes and a quick explanation of what we're talking about during this episode. But that in no way, shape, or form is the full show notes. So for every single episode, you can go straight to the website, and the website's going to give you links for different products, photos, links to articles that Eco Ground's actually written, and just any of the resources or information that's mentioned during the episode. I put those in the show notes for you so you can go find it in another location. So again, if anything in this episode resonates with you, please go directly to thecommunitygardenpodcast.ca and you're going to see the chunky show notes we put together for you. I'll stop talking now and we can dive right into the episode, and I really hope you enjoy. Let's dig in. Hello, Michelle. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you doing?
Good. So glad that you're here with us. If you want to just launch straight in with introducing yourself and maybe give us a little bit of background with when you started gardening and a bit of your gardening experience.
Sure, yeah. So my mom is a huge gardener. She has lived in her current house for the past 5 years or 6 years approximately, and she has a huge, beautiful garden. And I moved out 3 years ago into a home here in Brantford with my now fiance. And the first summer, we redid our backyard. It was all patchy and whatnot, so we tore up the sod and I decided to leave a few spots to build some gardens around the edges. So that's when I started gardening in the ground. Before that, I didn't want to mess with my mom's stuff too much, so I just had a couple pots here and there. But really, in the past 3 years, my green thumb has come out more.
It's amazing. Would you identify as a beginner gardener, an intermediate gardener? Like, where would you put yourself within that range?
I would definitely say I'm still a beginner gardener. I mean, I've learned a lot from when I just started a few years ago, but yeah, still very much learning as I go.
Yeah. So do you know what growing zone you're located in?
No, I have no idea.
That's
I tried
okay.
looking that up yesterday. I'm like, I don't get this.
No, it's totally okay. So you're in Brantford, right? So
Yeah,
for those
pretty central.
Yeah. So you're near me, I think. So for those of us who are listening, growing zones, Canada and the US are divided up into growing zones. And it just essentially indicates like a lot of plants and cultivars are divided up by what can be grown in a specific zone. So here in Brantford, we're in 6B. Growing zones do change sometimes. Not all growing zones change, but for example, the US just changed some of their growing zones 2 years ago. So for anyone who's looking to figure out what their growing zone is, it's a quick Google search. You can go onto the Farmer's Almanac and it'll tell you. But growing zone's great for trying to figure out maybe what you can grow in your area, but the most important piece for us is when is our last frost date. And for this area, it is May 5th. And obviously big quotations because we're in Southern Ontario and our weather is extremely unpredictable. So even though our last frost date is expected around May 5th, this year we had a frost early June, or at least a frost warning early June. Super variable, but you are in growing zone 6B and your frost date would be May 5th. Your last frost date would be May 5th for the spring. And so you plant in ground, right?
I start from seeds, and I typically follow the rule of thumb of waiting until after the May 2-4 long weekend to
Mm-hmm.
plant outdoors. I think we had some nice weather before that, so I start my seeds in my mudroom, which doesn't have any insulation really or like central heating. I would stick like a space heater in there just to keep the space warm for the seeds. And then on those warmer days, I bring them outside because it was nice and easy.
Yeah.
But I think I forgot to bring one kind of basket of seeds in, like you said, around that frost morning in June because they didn't make it.
Oh, shoot. Hey. Oh, no. I know. I think some areas got like a light frost, and it really just depended on where you are. And of course, frost can affect your plants if they're planted directly in the ground. But typically, if your plants are raised up, if they're on any form of concrete, if they're in raised garden beds, if they're on tables, the frost doesn't usually settle. The frost typically tries to settle directly on the ground. So, yeah, that sucks. It just came through and smacked them, eh? So, how would you explain your soil quality? We're in Brantford, so most of us have a really sandy, well draining soil.
hmm
Would you say that's yours?
Yeah, definitely. It's pretty dry, it seems. So when we were digging up space for the gardens, I did dig a few inches into the ground and added some triple mix and whatnot. I do also have a small raised garden bed, and after filling that with probably hundreds of dollars of soil, I learned after the fact that I could have added cardboard and sticks and whole bunch of other stuff at the bottom to help with the drainage and not spending as much money on soil, but
Yeah.
it's part of the learning process.
Absolutely. I know we learn something every single year. And then also side note, Eagle Ground does have a program for residential growers. It's our host garden program. So we'll actually give you plants, compost, seeds, all that kind of stuff. And the only thing we ask is you consider donating a portion of your harvest to the communities. In the future, if you do need a compost top up, you're welcome to reach out to us. We utilize the city's compost. They connect us with a large amount of it, and it allows us to get it out in there to some of our growing or some of our gardeners' gardens. So just for future reference. But yeah, we're here in Brantford, and a lot of people have really sandy, really well draining soil, which is a blessing and a curse. Nothing here is going to get waterlogged. It allows for root systems to really, really reach. It's not clay. But then at the same time, it dries out really quick and can be deprived of nutrients pretty quickly. So again, blessing and a curse. I'm just right off the river here, and we have like massive rocks, and I plant in
Oh
ground
yeah.
too. Like I don't care. I'll dig those rocks out over time. I'm just curious, do you experience the same thing? Do you have the really rocky base at all?
Not really, actually. I haven't found that to be the case. I do have a few trees and large bushes in my backyard too, so the only issue that I face if I'm like expanding the garden is just root systems
Yeah.
from the trees and bushes.
Well, that's amazing. Sounds like you got a pretty good setup. I'm curious, what's the size of your garden? What are you growing? What does the setup look like?
I actually recently expanded it. I believe before it was like 10 feet long and maybe 2 to 3 feet wide, but now I've connected it to this other garden that was between my shed and my fence that was about maybe 6 feet long and same like 2 to 3 feet wide. So the space between there was maybe another 6 feet. So I don't know. Now it's over 20 feet
It's
long.
pretty big, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
it's a
amazing.
lot of space,
Hmm.
and I'm still figuring out the best way to utilize the space. But again, it's kind of trial and error.
Yeah, it's a skill you build on. What do you have growing in the garden right now?
So I made a list here so I wouldn't forget anything. So in my raised garden box, I have that as my herb planter. And, we were talking about frost a little bit too. Well, I found in the raised garden bed, there were a few things that lasted all throughout the winter, actually. I think we had a pretty mild winter this year. So my parsley lasted and my thyme. I also had basil and dill in there. And last year they had lots of seeds fall into the garden. So I had lots of little plants popping up this year. And then I also just recently got some green onions at the store. So instead of, throwing out the roots, I tossed them in there and they seem to be doing okay, but we'll see as time goes on. And then I have an area with cabbage and broccoli. And then there's an area, like a pretty large section of it that's all tomatoes. And then I'm trying to do cucumbers, peppers, zucchini. And then in more of the shady area, I have my lettuce. So I actually got some seeds from the library a few years ago. I believe they were Grand Rapids.
Hmm.
Some lettuce that I actually didn't. hear of before. And then I believe there was also romaine and spinach,
Mhm.
but the spinach didn't turn out this year because I think it was too hot or something. It went right
Yeah.
into flowering.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm trying to grow some kale again this year too.
Nice. I find that kale will also overwinter. I don't know if you've had it overwinter before. And then in the second year, it'll almost go straight into seed production in, late spring. And it's really fun to watch the seeds develop, but it takes so long. It takes so long and then it like takes up garden real estate, but it's really
Yeah,
fun too.
that's actually where I am right now. So my kale, this is like the second or maybe even third year I've had the same kale, and I heard that it gets really bitter or chewy or something after time. So I was harvesting it throughout the winter, and like you said, this spring it went into seeds, and I'd never seen kale seeds before, the little string bean looking pods.
Yeah.
So that was pretty cool. And first it flowered and there were a lot of bees around. I was like, oh, this is nice. I just loved watching the process. And so now I'm just waiting, like, when are these seeds going to be ready? And I don't know, half the time I do Google things like, okay, what's happening? What am I supposed to do next? And half the time I don't. The other half of the time I don't. I'm just like, well, let's see what happens.
Yeah, I'm the same way in my garden. I'm very trial and error. I'm also a really busy person, and of course, I do this for a living too. So I really do my best to like try and maintain it as a hobby and not it feeling like a chore. So I'll just let things
Hmm.
happen too. So that process when a plant gets really, really, really tall really fast and the leaves start to get pretty bitter and you can tell it's going to start to flower, that's called bolting. And typically, this will happen to lettuce, spinach, cilantro. It happens a lot with cilantro, kale, pretty much any of your greens and some of your herbs and anything leafy. It'll bolt really, really quick. That's what they call it. And then everything gets bitter, and it's almost
Mm.
impossible to stop a plant from bolting. And then how quickly it's going to put on seeds and develop seeds, it's usually a long time. For example, like arugula or lettuce or kale will put on really, really long stalks. They'll put out their little yellow flowers. The pollinators will come and pollinate the flowers because that's what's needed to produce the seed or produce the fruit. And then it puts on those little bean looking pods. And then you have to wait for those pods to dry out. So last year at Earl Hague, we left a bed of kale because I was like, okay, this is going to be a really cool experiment for all of us. We were running
Yeah.
programs there, and it probably took 2.5 months from when
Oh
the kale
gosh.
bolted to actually
Oh
hitting the
no.
seed. And I was like, this process was cool, but I'm never doing this again.
Yeah, it like you said, it takes up a lot of space
Hmm.
and they're so tall that they're starting to hang over.
Yeah,
So I have to
absolutely.
find something to keep them up and out of the other areas of the garden. But I think my parsley plant that made it through the winter is bolting now too
Hmm.
because all of a sudden the stalks are very thick and it's very tall and it looks like it's starting to flower.
Hmm.
I've still been using the parsley leaves even though it's not as like bushy, and I haven't noticed a bitter taste. Maybe I'm lucky or maybe it's gonna just hit me in the face one day.
I think
But
parsley is one of the ones it's a little bit slower going. You can counteract that bolting process. And I don't think the flavor of the leaf changes.
oh, okay.
But parsley is biennial, so it will flower in its second year. But also, it's really easy to start from seeds. So you could probably throw some seeds down
Hmm.
now, and then by the time that guy's ready to be pulled out, you already have some new parsley coming. And don't get me wrong, for the folks listening here, if you're gardening to save seed, it's an incredibly rewarding process. There's just a lot of patience involved. Like, you think the seedling to vegetable process is long, the plant to like bolting and then to be able to actually collect the seed, that's also a very long time. So lots of patience is needed.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I'm curious, like you have a very large garden, and I'd love to hear what some of your routine actions or what your chores look like. How often do you water the garden? How often do you weed the garden? Do you implement any maintenance setups or anything like that to help manage that workload?
So I recently installed this irrigation system that I bought off of Amazon, and it was such a pain in the butt to put together. I seriously doubted whether or not that it was going to work, and I was so frustrated with it. I can't even describe I can't describe it because I probably shouldn't use the words all that I want to use to describe it on here, but I persevered and it is actually working now. So essentially, it's just a thin or a small hose, and you cut into it, and then you attach it to this kind of T nozzle. You can choose a mister head or a dripper, dropper, whatever.
Yeah.
And the process of just properly fixing the hose onto the tee, because it's got a spear shape on either side. And so you have to go over that. So you really have to use a lot of hand strength. And my fingers and my thumbs are double jointed, so they bend backwards a bit when I apply pressure. So I was doing this for hours, and my thumbs hurt so bad after this. But finally, I was able to get the hoses properly over the little nozzles, and then I secured it with zip ties so that the water pressure wouldn't detach things and it wouldn't fall apart if the water pressure was too high, because that was what was happening before. And that was the frustrating part. But the zip ties helped. And so now I can just turn it on and leave it. The only issue, so I've used a 50-foot long hose now and just wrapped it back around so that the larger garden with more of the vegetable plants, it has two, I guess, hoses. So one closer to one side and the other hose is closer to the other side. But the water pressure doesn't travel as far, like it doesn't travel as well down to the end of the line. That's the only thing about the system.
Yeah.
But I check on it just to make sure that all areas are getting enough water. And sometimes I do have to go back and water just like certain areas. But
Mm-hmm.
that was what I just found watering to be a tedious task. So this has helped a lot with that. I would just tell whoever is thinking about it to, ensure that they have the patience and the perseverance to go at it. It took me a few hours over a few days, but yeah, I think it's worth it now. And other than, you know, watering to maintain and my garden, I also just consistently am weeding the garden. I do that a lot in the springtime before I even get the plants in,
Mm-hmm.
because I do have a Rose of Sharon tree that's now in the garden. It was before in a space like between the two gardens, but since I've expanded it and attached them, now the Rose of Sharon's just in the garden. I know that I'm going to regret that next year because it does drop a lot of seeds. And yeah, it takes hours just to weed out those little seedlings, the Rose of Sharon seedlings in the springtime. And then now it's just kind of maintenance and going in there.
Mm-hmm.
But I find it, meditative to like weed the garden. The only problem really that I have is I kind of like sit in the garden if I'm weeding. I don't care too much about getting dirty, but I've found that I have a lot of ants in my garden,
Oh
so
no.
I'll get bit on the legs and
Oh
whatnot.
no. That's a pain in the
Yeah.
butt. I've never experienced that. Although when we were pulling the wood off of the beds at Earl Hague when we went to replace them, a lot of the ants will live in the wood
Mm.
surrounding garden beds, and we were being bit a lot. That was not a fun experience with the
Do you know if
hose. Oh,
it's, sorry, do you know if the ants, if it's like the rotting wood or is it just,
it wasn't on any new wood. It was in all of the rotting wood. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I
Well,
don't
I
know
wonder
too
if,
much about ants, but yeah.
okay, yeah. I was wondering if maybe that was a sign that maybe, there's a rotting wood, maybe a fence post in the ground or something,
Oh,
because,
maybe. I use really big wood mulch chips in my garden. That's how I suppress my
oh,
weeds, and that's how I
yeah.
maintain moisture. And we've never had an ant problem in there. And I feel like if they were going to be attracted to rotted wood, then
Oh,
it's so funny
yeah.
because someone listening to this probably has the answer to this. If you know what
Tell
we're talking
us.
about, if you know
Yeah.
why these ants are attracted to this rotted wood, send me a message. Send
Hmm.
me a message and I can update Michelle here. You were talking about how with the hose, it's not getting water pressure all the way to the other side. I think this is a common problem that people have with irrigation systems. Some people will use soaker hoses, which are very similar,
Hmm.
like probably the same style of irrigation system where the hose essentially just leaks water over time, and same issue because it's losing pressure as it's leaking water right
Hmm.
throughout the hose. That's a pain in the butt, but the nice thing about plants is they'll tell you when they're thirsty. And
Hmm.
if it's a quick spray every so often, and we've been getting really good rain this year so far, it's currently
Yeah.
June 18th, and I've only had to water Earl Hag twice. And we've had a pretty good rain year. So hopefully
Yeah.
that continues and you don't have to water the tail end of that garden too much.
That's why I like having the rows of the hose,
Hmm.
because it'll get, wet either way.
Absolutely.
But what you can do with this irrigation system is you can adjust the, I don't know what the word
Like the
is, but
flow rate.
Yeah, I guess so. You can turn off some of them, and yeah, you can adjust how much water or like the mist is coming out. So what I've tried to do is put the ones at the beginning very, very low, and then, increasingly open up the nozzle
That
as
makes
it gets
sense.
farther down the line.
Yeah.
Lots of trial and error. You're turning on the water and then turning all the nozzles and then turning off the water, and yeah,
This
just
is
going
this
back
is
and forth.
probably how people feel when they're setting up a lawn irrigation too. Our folks who love their lawns. So
Yeah.
you have experience growing seedlings. You had mentioned that you grow everything from seed in your mud room, and I'm wondering if you can delve into that experience and how long you've been growing from seedling, and what does your setup look like, and what tips do you have for somebody who is looking to grow their own seedlings?
Yeah, well, last year I did buy some seedlings from, I forget what the place was called, but a garden store. But this year I've grown everything from seeds myself. And I would just say keeping the room warm was really important. It's good that it's like a small room and that it can heat up pretty fast with the space heater. I actually don't have any of those UV lights. I've been thinking about getting some. I do have a window in the mudroom and it does get direct sunlight, and that seems to have worked so far. So that's pretty much what I've done. Just keeping it warm, and some of the seeds have made it, some haven't. I did get one of those. I don't even know what you call these either, but it's just like a tray, and you could put like individual seeds in each one, and then it has a lid to create a mini greenhouse to keep the moisture in there. Forget what you call those.
Yeah, they're kind of like like Jiffy trays. Jiffy's the main brand that will produce those. You can get those in Home Depot, like department stores, Walmart, places like that. Those are
Mm-hmm.
really handy, like you said, for keeping that moisture in, especially because anyone who grows seedlings know that they can dry out super quick. Hey, it's me. Just a really quick note about Jiffy pots or anything that is put out by the Jiffy brand. Amazing, affordable, great for especially beginner gardeners. I do want to note, when you are planting your seedlings into the ground, even though all Jiffy products say that you can plant them in the ground with the plant still in the pots, whether that be the mesh pots that expand when you add water, or if it's the paper pots, please remove the pot before you put the plant in the ground. You're not going to regret it. I know it's an extra step, but it's really going to assist your plant with growing, especially the mesh ones. That's actually like a plastic, and you're putting that plastic directly into the ground. And both the plastic and the paper really limits the root systems from being able to branch out. So Jiffy Pot, great brand, great products, but please, please remove whatever pot it is you're using before that plant goes in the ground. Okay, bye. I'm really surprised and delighted to hear that you had success growing seedlings with just a window. Some people have a hard time because you really need to be, it needs to be like a south facing window in order, east or south facing window in order to have enough sunlight to be able to grow seedlings like that. That's amazing. I think that's so cool. Kudos to you. And for you and anyone else who's listening, if you were interested in purchasing grow lights, make sure you're getting LED full spectrum lights. And I'm not one to promote Amazon, but Amazon does have really, really well priced grow light systems that will link up, and we utilize them. Honestly, we have an insane amount of grow lights now. So you can also buy the panels that they used to sell, especially for cannabis growers. They'd buy these big LED panels that are, $300-$400. No, thank you. I'm not interested in these massive LED panels. So I purchase the LED full spectrum light strips that you can get on Amazon. The company we usually purchase from is, I think it's pronounced Berbria. We'll put it in the show notes. But if you were ever interested in purchasing, again, Amazon's kind of a really good place to source some of those things for a really good price. Did
I
you
think I'll invest in some of those for next spring.
Yeah, yeah. Did
Make
you
my life easier.
experience any, did you have any hurdles when it came to growing the seedlings? Anything that you were like, oh, this is not going well, or I need to figure out how to fix this next year?
Well, like I said, the mudroom's pretty small, so it did get quite cluttered in there. I'm pretty sure my fiance wasn't happy about all the dirt from growing my seeds in there. And then it was, tedious. I would bring them all out, and I had a lot. I'd bring them all out into the sun on nicer days, and then at night I'd just bring them all back inside, and it was like a 20-minute ordeal. So I would say even just, I don't know, a mini greenhouse or just something that I can organize them on, and then put those LED is that the
Yeah.
grow light strips
Yep.
under each kind of shelf.
That's what I do.
I think
Yeah.
that would be an awesome setup. Yeah, and it would
Yeah.
be more organized and I wouldn't have to move things around so frequently.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
should send you a picture of my setup, and I'll put a picture of my setup in the show notes as well for those who are interested in growing seedlings. But we have this very large plant rack that's 25 years old. We got it from Vessi. Well, we didn't get it from Vessi's. My partner's grandmother got it from Vessi's as a gift, and she gifted it to us. So that's outfitted with grow lights, and they have these big trays. And
Oh,
same thing,
awesome.
every day we would take the trays outside and like hundreds of seedlings. And then I also have a bunch of those mini greenhouses that are outfitted with lights. We actually used one of those greenhouses at a children's program that we did at the Brant County Library and at Sunny Hill Community Garden. So we ran like a little gardeners program, and the kids had this greenhouse set up and they went and they grew their own seedlings. So it works really well. I'll send you a picture, and again, fairly cost effective for those who want to level up their seedling growing. Did you find with the window that your seedlings got leggy at all?
I'm trying to remember. I don't think so. I don't think so, just because they would be reaching
That's
for the
amazing.
sun sort of thing.
Yeah,
Is that what
yeah.
you
So
mean?
there was, yeah, when
I
they
don't
they
think
start
so.
to they're searching for the light and they start to get really
Mhm.
tall. I think that's incredible that you were able to do that with windows, and I think that's just a big testament to folks who don't want to grow seedlings because they think that they need to invest in grow lights and things like that. And if you have an east or a south facing window, like I promise it's possible.
I think mine's a south-facing window, so I think that's why it worked out, and
Hmm.
and just keeping that room super warm too. And I believe there were some that did fail. I honestly can't remember because I probably started them there in the mudroom 2 months ago, or maybe even 3 months ago.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, and then I think I started keeping them in the little greenhouse that I have once it got warm enough.
Hmm.
But
And then also you were taking them outside every day, which is another really
Mhm.
important factor when it comes to growing seedlings. Obviously, it allows them to access more sunlight than they would inside. And also, they go through the process of hardening off. And for folks listening,
Yeah.
obviously taking a seedling that's been grown inside of a building with no wind, with no temperature fluctuations, it's very difficult when they end up going outside and the sun can burn them, the wind can break them. So, making sure you're introducing them regularly to outside conditions is a really, really important piece of developing healthy seedlings. So it sounds like you
Mhm.
did a great job. I think that's so cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I think as long as it was above 5, 10 degrees, I think in March I was bringing them outside
Yeah.
every day on the nicer days. So that's when they got their sunlight. I'd come home from work and check on my babies.
I know. And then 6, 7 o'clock would near and it's starting to get dark because, this is when the world was still gloomy and you're scrambling to get them all back inside before it gets too cold. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I understand that you grow tomatoes and that you have a lot of success with tomatoes. I'm curious to know if you have any favorite varieties and you have any tips or tricks for people who are maybe struggling with their tomatoes or kind of want to dig a little bit deeper to, haha, literally, to grow healthier tomatoes and produce more fruit.
Well, I feel like my tomatoes match the rest of my gardening vibe, which is just kind of like toss a couple seeds in, see what happens, because last year's tomato seeds that had fallen into the garden, I guess the seeds, germinated, and this spring I counted 44 tomato plants in my garden. So I don't really know what kind they are, but I'm assuming it's grape tomatoes because that's
Hmm.
what I had most of last year, maybe a couple Romas. But honestly, I don't know like they're so happy in there. I did rearrange them because they were growing in clumps. So I did move them around and I did remove some of them and I just gifted them to family, friends, and clients because there were just so many.
Yeah.
But I have heard, a couple tips for when the tomatoes start to mature more is like removing the bottom leaves so
Yep.
that it can focus on getting the energy to the fruits. I also recently saw something about almost laying your tomato plant when you're transplanting it, laying it almost on its side so that the like more of the stem and like the area where it has all those little bumps can that those bumps can form into roots and it can just grow a better root system. I don't know if you know anything more about that.
Yeah, so I agree with you with removing the foliage just to keep the foliage off the ground, stop any mildew from producing. And then, yeah, the rule of thumb with tomatoes is bury them as deep as possible so that they can put on really deep, healthy root systems, which allows them to access water better, access nutrients better. And some people can't dig that deep, right? Like for my tomatoes, I probably dug at least a foot deep, which is a lot. And then the alternative is, to grow them on their side. The only thing that I struggle with that is now their root systems can only really access the water closer to the surface level. And then same with the nutrients. And then also depending on how, hopefully your tomatoes aren't planted that close together, but some people like to practice square foot gardening or don't have a ton of garden real estate. So they squeeze things in a little bit more, and that would start to impede on their ability to grow things where that root system is planted. But it's a really, really, if you have the space to do it, it is a good opportunity to help put on a bigger root system. And in the case where you have irrigation, a little bit less concerns around accessing water and stuff like that. The other issue that I have heard is that because you're planting them on their side, you have to be really careful bending their stem so that because it'll have to be at like a 90-degree angle. Sometimes the stem will snap. So just be really careful and really gentle if you do choose to plant it like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah. Any other tips or tricks for tomatoes? I have one if you're maxed out.
Not specifically tomatoes. I guess the only other thing that I've done to support my garden in general is just saving my eggshells and drying them out, putting them in my magic bullet, making a powder, and then sprinkling it. I know I can't remember what chemical is in them.
It's calcium,
but I know
think it's usually calcium. Yeah.
So you can't put too much, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to overwhelm the plants. But that's something that I recently did.
The nice thing about doing that is it would be very difficult to overdose plants because it actually takes those eggshells quite a while to break down. So it's not immediately bioavailable to the plants. It actually has to pretty much rot, and then the plants are able to take it up. But calcium can really help. Nutrients in general and consistent watering with tomatoes will help avoid blossom rot. So it's a really good way to just be able to consistently and passively provide them with some more nutrients. Yeah, which is always a good idea.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah. So within your garden, you've been gardening on your own now for probably 3-ish years, and you do identify as a beginner. And of course, we know that gardening is entirely trial and error, and even somebody who's been gardening for 30 years is still learning new things all the time. Are there any hurdles that you've had to navigate around, or any, issues that have come up within your garden that you've had to sort out? I know you said you do a lot of Googling.
Yeah, I have had mostly issues with bugs eating my plants. Otherwise, I would say the only issue is, like we talked about before, when it's too hot and plants go like right into flowering instead of focusing on growing the leaves, like spinach, for example. But yeah, I would say the main issue is the bugs because I have zucchini and cucumber plants, and a few of them they've slowly started to disappear over time, and I can never see what kind of bugs are eating them. I've never seen bugs on the leaves, so maybe they're coming out at night or something, or maybe it's an animal. I don't know.
Yeah, but it could be an animal. Honestly, it's probably slugs. Slugs are silent but deadly. And what I do for slugs, so we use a heavy layer of mulch in our garden, which is our first layer of defense. Second layer of defense, I do, provided you don't have any dogs. If you have any dogs, you need to make sure you do this when they're not going to be in the garden breathing it in. But I'll lay down diatomaceous earth on the leaves of my plants. The slugs do not like diatomaceous earth. Most bugs don't. And then the last thing is, this is very funny, but I take little leftover takeout cups and I cut off the last inch, so there's a little mini tray, and I put beer in it, and then I put that into the garden, and the slugs are attracted to the beer, and it unfortunately kills them, and then they don't eat my plants. So I had a lot of success with the beer cups last year. This year they don't seem to be as interested. Once I put the mulch down, but yeah, last year, I would have cups full of slugs every single night.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. Do you just end up with a cup of dead slugs?
Yeah, and then I just dump them back in the garden. And it's literally, you wake up in the morning, you're like, oh, I have a cup of dead slugs. Yum.
Oh, gosh. Well, I feel like that is maybe one of the easiest fixes, because I think I have both those supplies at home.
Yeah.
So beer and a cup.
And yeah, do it. Definitely give it a try. And also diatomaceous earth. You can get it in most nurseries. Just be very careful that when you are applying it, it usually has a little nozzle and you'll just squirt it out. It's a dust. So just make sure you're not breathing it in, because you just don't want that in your lungs if you don't need to. It is a natural compound, so it's not like a synthetic fertilizer or synthetic pesticide or anything like that, but you just, especially with dogs or any pets that you have that might be in the garden. We have ducks, so I have to make sure the ducks are like
Oh my
locked
gosh.
away when we go to apply it, because it's just not good for the respiratory system of small animals. So
Mm.
just keep that in mind. So, just to pivot a little bit, I understand that you run Golden Age Management, and I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of background on the organization and the work that you do, and if there are any ties into gardening and any support that you might provide when it comes to gardening, and if you also have any tips for older adults that may be wanting to get into gardening but have mobility concerns and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. So, I guess a little background about Golden Age Management is that we provide services that support not only older adults, but also their care partners or caregivers, and just help them in navigating those changes that happen in later life, whether they're, health related or maybe familial. So we just provide that extra little bit of support either in the home or maybe accompanying them to appointments or different services within the community, acting as that. But the majority of my educational background and my professional focus has been on the mental, social, emotional, and recreational well-being of older adults. So, hobbies are really important to me and my work, and just keeping people aging actively, keeping people feeling as if they have a sense of purpose and even a sense of belonging too, because I feel like oftentimes our hobbies connect us to one another. So that's really, I think, what gardening is to me. It's just like an extra, like that recreational or leisure aspect of my life that makes me feel like I'm doing something, like I'm accomplishing something, and I'm doing something good for myself, my body, my family, because we eat a lot of those vegetables, right? But in terms of working with clients in their gardens, so I think I mentioned I have a lot of extra tomato plants, so I did give some of those away
Yeah.
too. But for all clients that want to maybe maintain their gardens, but maybe, like you said, have some mobility issues, we've looked into doing raised garden beds or just like pots on, tables and whatnot. So just trying to keep it simple and just focusing on like a few different plants, vegetables, rather than, trying to maintain a full in-ground garden bed. So I think with the services that we provide too, we can support in that maintenance as well, just with the watering or weeding. Sometimes people have like bigger projects in mind too, or, so that would be outsourced and we can make those connections to landscaping companies, for
Mhm.
example.
Amazing. It's really wonderful work. And I know we met for the first time. We were at the seniors fair at the Brantford Public Library a few weeks ago. And that's when we had first met. And we were sitting directly across from each other. And
Yeah.
people would go chat with you about, maintenance and things like that. And then they come chat with me about how they have mobility concerns, they can't bend down and things like that. And I thought it was, I
Mm,
thought it was very
yeah.
funny that we had been
Yeah.
sitting directly across from each other. So yeah. Well, do you have
Mhm.
anything to add about your gardening experience? Any advice for somebody who, is interested in dabbling in gardening, but maybe they don't know where to start? Or, as a beginner, you might be able to pass on some wisdom.
Well, I guess tying into my business too, and for beginners, I would say look into maybe taking a course or joining some kind of communal activity like gardening at equal grounds. But Almas from True Leaf Garden Consulting and I did run a workshop for microgreens and herb plantings. I found those were such a fantastic way to get people learning, get people talking about gardening, and just getting people connected too. It was a great learning experience for me too, just sitting in on the workshops and supporting that. And microgreens, for example, are such a great way to bring gardening like into your home, and it's so like low maintenance, but you still get the whole like nutritional value as well. Like for me, that's mostly what it is, right? It's like growing your own food. That's why I just exclusively do vegetable gardens. I mean, I have a couple house plants, but I usually kill those. With the vegetable plants, those are my babies, and I like to
Yeah.
see them, come to fruition with the actual vegetables. And so that was the nice thing about microgreens too, because it's such a quick turnaround, you get to add it to your food. So that workshop was really great too. And that's my little piece of advice. Maybe look around and see, where you can learn some things with your community and ask questions and get that hands-on experience, because that's definitely how I like to learn, is getting out there and talking to people.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, Almas, we love you, Almas. If you're listening to this, Almas is one of our board of directors. She recently joined this year, and she also helped with the Little Gardeners program in St. George. And Almas also runs garden consulting business called True Leaf Gardening. We'll put it in the show notes. And yeah, it was really cool to see that connection made again, full circle, to see you sitting across from me and knowing that Almas
Yeah.
had just done those
Yeah.
workshops with you. Yeah, thank you so much for chatting with us. This was a really amazing conversation, and so grateful for you to share your experiences with us. Michelle, thank you so much for chatting with me. It was really amazing to hear about your journey, and I feel like this interview is almost information overload. So for our beginner gardeners who are listening to this, I hope you learned something. I hope you can take some of this information back into your garden and maybe even dabble in growing your own seedlings next year. So at the end of every episode, I want to leave you with some gardening wisdom. And I want to quickly chat about fertilizing your garden, specifically topping it up with compost. So for me, it's now October, and we are now working on cleaning our gardens up for the season. Again, we're located in Zone 6B in Brantford in Southern Ontario, and this is going to apply for pretty much all of Canada at this point. I personally like to do this action in the fall as opposed to in the spring, and we really encourage our community gardeners to do this in the fall as well. We try to encourage everyone to top up their gardens with compost now instead of doing it in the spring. And honestly, the main reason is for time savings. Like, I can tell you right now, come springtime, I am so busy. I'm up to my neck in work and I want to do so many amazing things. And then sometimes I just feel like lugging a bunch of wheelbarrows out to dump soil is like the most tedious task in the spring. So, especially if you run a community garden or you support a community garden, do your compost top ups right now. I promise you're not going to regret it. You're not going to lose a bunch of nutrients because it rains. It's going to allow it to settle in. And actually, that rain may even just pull the nutrients down into the lower parts of the soil, which will just make it more accessible next year for your plants that are looking for food down in the soil there. Thank you again to the City of Brantford and the Brant Community Foundation for funding this podcast. Also, a big thank you to our board of directors for letting me run with this project. It's been a ton of fun. The Community Garden podcast is administered by Equal Ground Community Gardens, and you can view this episode's show notes at thecommunitygardenpodcast.ca. Podcast production and editing is by Matt Wilfred at Nuthatch Consulting, and you can get in touch with Matt at nuthatchconsulting@gmail.com. Matt has been fabulous with helping us get this podcast up off the ground. Matt's actually listening to this as he edits it, and we've had a wonderful experience with Matt, and he's just provided so many resources to us and so much assistance that goes beyond editing. Our graphic design is done by Ben at All Day Breakfast. And thank you to our lovely podcast committee, Paulina, Charlene, and Kat, for all of your hard work. Please consider following, subscribing, rating, reviewing, doing all the things on whatever podcast platform you're using to help us reach more people. So by you interacting with us in those ways, it will push our podcast out to more folks. You can follow Equal Ground on Facebook at Equal Ground Community Gardens. And you can also join our Facebook support group at the same time. It's under the same name. And you can find us on Instagram at equal_ground. And finally, you can learn more about our organization at www.egcgbrant.ca. And if you would actually like to be on this podcast as a guest, please, 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 please consider it. You can email me at podcast@egcgbrant, or you can visit the show notes page at thecommunitygardenpodcast.ca. I just want to chat with anyone who has gardening experience. There's absolutely no prerequisite. It's really nice to just chat with regular people who garden. So please send me a message if that interests you. And finally, if you made it here, fun fact, I usually get our podcast episode up and going and like preset probably 5 days before it actually releases. when it goes onto our website, like when I add all the show notes onto the communitygardenpodcast.ca, it actually makes the episode available right away, because we also have a little widget there that connects you to the episode. So if you're listening and you want to maybe go to the show notes page and see if the next episode is ready, I dare you to do it because it probably is. All right, friends, thank you so much for listening this week. I'm so grateful to be here and to be chatting with you, and I really hope to see you next week.